For hours after Mount Vesuvius began erupting, Pompeii was still escapable. People did leave, others stayed. That is what makes the disaster more disturbing than the simple version most of us know. The people who died in Pompeii were not standing in a street, watching a wall of lava approach and refusing to run. They were making decisions inside a disaster that kept changing its rules. In 79 CE, Vesuvius did not look like a monster waiting to wake up. Its slopes were fertile. Vineyards and farms spread across the region. The people around the Bay of Naples knew earthquakes, but they did not have modern volcanology, emergency alerts, hazard maps, or an official telling them that a towering cloud over the mountain meant a Plinian eruption had begun. Even the word Plinian comes from this disaster, named after Pliny the Younger's later description of it. And earthquakes were familiar. Pompeii had been badly damaged by a major earthquake years earlier, and repairs were still visible around the city. Pliny the Younger wrote that smaller tremors in Campania were common enough not to cause much alarm. So when the ground shook again before and during the eruption, the signal was mixed with something people already knew. A warning is less useful when it looks like normal background noise. Then the mountain erupted, and the first danger was not a river of lava. It was material falling from the sky. Pumice and volcanic fragments began raining onto Pompeii. At first, that gave people a terrible but important choice. Go outside into falling debris and try to leave the city, or stay under a roof and hope the eruption passes. From our position, almost 2,000 years later, run sounds obvious. From a doorway in Pompeii with stones falling, the ground shaking and visibility getting worse, staying indoors could look safer for a while. That sounds minor, but it matters. Disasters are often easiest to understand after they are over. The pumice kept accumulating. Streets that had been familiar that morning became deep, unstable paths. Walking became harder. Doors could be blocked. Roofs took more and more weight. The archaeological park of Pompeii says the volcanic debris eventually reached around 3 meters in places during the first phase, and some victims were killed when roofs and walls collapsed. A house that had seemed like shelter could turn into a trap. Now, add darkness. Ash and the eruption cloud reduced daylight until people could struggle to see where they were going. Add repeated earthquakes. Add families trying to stay together. Add older people, children, injured people, enslaved workers who may not have been free to make their own decisions, and anyone who had already waited several hours because the building still seemed safer than the street. There was no single moment when a city official could say, "You have 40 minutes left." Some people also appear to have expected to come back. Archaeologists have found fugitives with coins and personal belongings. One man discovered in the Regio 5 excavations had a small hoard of silver and bronze coins with him. Another interpretation of the same escape scene noted an iron key among his possessions. A key is an ordinary thing. In a catastrophe, it becomes a clue. Perhaps someone left home thinking home would still exist later. Not everyone had the same chance to move. A man found during those Regio 5 excavations showed signs of a serious infection in his lower leg that may have made walking difficult. Researchers suggested that this could have slowed his escape. We cannot reconstruct every decision he made, and early interpretations of archaeological finds sometimes change. Still, the basic point is hard to miss. Why didn't they run? Assumes that everybody could run equally well. Many probably did escape. We do not know Pompeii's exact population on the day of the eruption, and we do not know the complete death toll. More than 1,000 victims have been found in the city, but the archaeological record is not a census. The existence of survivors is clear for another reason. After the eruption, surviving Pompeians returned and recovered possessions from buried buildings. So the famous bodies are not evidence that an entire city simply sat still and waited to die. The disaster also changed during the night and into the following day. The tall eruption column became unstable and collapsed, generating pyroclastic density currents, fast, ground-hugging mixtures of ash, gas, and volcanic material. This is the part that makes the familiar lava image especially misleading. You do not stand in front of a pyroclastic current, judge its speed, and then jog away. Once these currents reach Pompeii, the remaining options shrank brutally. They could pour through streets and openings, fill spaces that had escaped the pumice, carry fine ash, and expose people to lethal heat and gases. The exact cause of death was not identical for every victim, and researchers have debated the balance between thermal injury, ash inhalation, and asphyxia in particular deposits. What is clear is that the final phase was far more lethal than the earlier fall of pumice. Heat is part of that story. A 2010 study argued that exposure to the pyroclastic surges could cause extremely rapid death from heat. Later work has emphasized that conditions within a current can vary, and one reconstruction proposed that a relatively dilute current at Pompeii could have lasted long enough for fine ash and asphyxia to be deadly as well. So, everyone was instantly vaporized is not a good summary. Neither is everyone slowly suffocated. Pompeii contains victims of several hazards, in different places, at different stages of the eruption, and there was another killer under their feet. A 2024 study examined 2 skeletons in a building and concluded that wall collapse during strong earthquake shaking associated with the eruption likely killed them before the later pyroclastic currents arrived. That fits a broader picture. Falling pumice, structural collapse, seismic shaking, heat, ash, and toxic gases were overlapping hazards. The city was not destroyed by one clean mechanism. This is also why the plaster casts can fool us. They look like bodies turned to stone. They are not. After some victims were buried in fine volcanic material, their soft tissues decomposed and left cavities in the hardened ash around their remains. Beginning in the 19th century, archaeologist Giuseppe Fiorelli's method filled some of those voids with plaster. The result preserved the shape of a person, folds of clothing, sometimes details that feel impossibly intimate. But what you are looking at is a cast of an empty space that a body once occupied, often with bones still inside. Only a little over 100 such casts were made, even though remains of more than 1,000 victims have been found at Pompeii. The famous figures in the Garden of the Fugitives are therefore a tiny, unusually vivid part of a much larger archaeological record. Pompeii was not perfectly frozen in time either. That phrase is useful, but too neat. Survivors came back to recover valuables. Later thieves dug tunnels through buried rooms. Stone, marble, and lead were removed. Early excavators also tunneled into the city looking for desirable objects. The Pompeii we see is a mixture of catastrophic preservation, later disturbance, excavation, and restoration. And yet the small things are astonishing. Walls still carry election advertisements. Graffiti include names, jokes, insults, and obscene lines. Archaeologists found a wooden box whose contents included jewelry, beads, gems, and protective amulets, including phallic charms. Other houses were still being renovated when the eruption came. In one place, you can study a political slogan. In another, the mark of a piece of furniture. In another, the possessions someone apparently did not manage to carry away. That is what makes the question, why didn't they flee, so useful, as long as we do not use it to judge them. Some fled early. Some waited because the first phase looked survivable. Some sheltered from falling rock. Some may have tried to protect relatives or property. Some had physical limits. Some probably thought the worst had passed and moved too late. And once the streets were buried, buildings were failing, earthquakes were shaking the city, and pyroclastic currents were arriving. Escape was no longer the simple option it had been hours earlier. Pompeii is often presented as a city caught in one final instant. It is better understood as a chain of decisions made under worsening information. The eruption did not begin with certain death. That was exactly the problem. For a while, there was still time to choose, and nobody standing there knew how quickly that time was disappearing.
Thanks for watching! If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. See you in the next one!